When a flight worker mocked a black woman for her accent, she thought it was just another moment of superiority. But by the end of the flight, she'd be the one apologizing. Watch what happens when you judge someone too quickly. At the bustling boarding gate of a major international airport, the air buzzed with voices, rolling suitcases, and the occasional call for final passengers. Amid the crowd stood a black woman, modestly dressed in a plain blouse and long skirt, clutching her boarding pass with both hands. Her posture was gentle, her demeanor quiet, but graceful. As the line moved forward, she stepped up to the counter with a soft smile and politely asked a question about her seat. Her voice carried a lilting accent, African, maybe Caribbean, clear, respectful, and tinged with warmth. Behind the desk, the flight attendant glanced up, her eyes sweeping over the woman's clothes, her expression quickly shifting from routine politeness to veiled contempt. She gave a half-hearted nod, but didn't respond to the question directly. Instead, she leaned toward a colleague and, barely lowering her voice, repeated the woman's words in a mocking imitation of her accent. Her lips curled into a smirk. The colleague stifled a laugh, nudging another worker beside him. In seconds, a quiet ripple of chuckles passed among them, low, cruel, and careless. The woman heard it. Her eyes flickered slightly, just for a moment. She stood straighter, offered a small nod of gratitude, and said, "Thank you," with sincerity, even though it wasn't deserved. Her tone remained even, unshaken, but something in the way she walked away suggested she was familiar with such moments, like she had lived this scene 100 times before. As she made her way down the jet bridge, the whispers didn't stop. Behind her, one attendant whispered, "Probably flying for the first time." Another laughed and added, "Hope she knows which end of the plane to sit on." Their laughter faded only when another passenger stepped up to the counter. Unbothered outwardly, the woman kept walking, each step measured, her gaze calm. She didn't turn back, didn't flinch. Instead, she moved forward with a quiet dignity that none of the staff noticed, or maybe chose not to see. What they saw was a simple woman with an unfamiliar voice. What they missed was someone carrying more strength than they could ever guess. Inside the plane, the hum of overhead fans blended with the quiet shuffle of passengers settling in. The black woman took her seat in economy, slipping her small bag beneath the chair in front of her. She opened a worn but well-loved hardcover book and began to read, her posture calm and her focus inward. Around her, the energy buzzed with idle chatter and the occasional clang of luggage bins. The attendants moved through the aisle with practiced swiftness, offering smiles to some and skipping others without pause. When they passed her, their glances were brief, their expressions cool, their presence impersonal. After some time in the air, the woman pressed the call button. When the familiar chime rang out, the same flight attendant from the gate approached, her politeness thin as paper. The woman politely requested a glass of water. The attendant blinked, tilted her head, and in a loud, mocking tone, repeated the word "wata" in a heavy imitation of the woman's accent. A couple of passengers looked up. The attendant gave a tight smile and said, "Sure thing, sweetheart," with forced cheer, before turning around and striding back to the galley. As soon as she was out of view, she let out a chuckle and repeated the accent to a fellow crew member, adding, "They all sound the same to me." The other crew member laughed, shaking his head, and muttered something about economy passengers always being a handful. A few rows away, passengers shifted uncomfortably, having heard enough to sense something wasn't right. No one spoke up. No one questioned the behavior. Silence settled like dust. Back in her seat, the woman quietly sipped her water when it was finally brought, then returned to her book. Her face revealed nothing. The older man beside her, who had been quietly observing, leaned over slightly and said, "You carry yourself with grace." I don't think I could stay that calm. She smiled gently, her eyes tired but kind, and replied, "Thank you. I've learned to let their words pass over me. Doesn't mean they don't leave a mark, though." He nodded in quiet understanding, and for a few moments they sat in companionable silence. Outside the window, clouds drifted like mountains in the sky. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, murmurs began to stir among the crew. A message had been passed from the captain's radio. A VIP was on board. An international figure, someone of influence and global recognition. The news traveled fast among the attendants, sparking curiosity and tension. But no one knew yet that the person they had mocked was the very one they were now scrambling to identify. As the wheels of the plane touched down with a soft jolt, a calm voice echoed through the cabin, instructing passengers to remain seated. The cabin lights brightened, and people began to stretch and gather their belongings. Amid the routine shuffle, a senior crew member in a crisp uniform stepped briskly down the aisle, scanning the rows with intention. His eyes landed on the black woman seated near the middle of the economy section. He approached her with a composed smile and a respectful tilt of the head. "Ma'am," he said gently, his tone markedly different from the others. "On behalf of our airline, welcome. We've been informed of your presence and will have an escort waiting for you at the gate." Nearby passengers turned their heads, curious. The woman nodded graciously, quietly closing her book and preparing to stand. A murmur ran through the cabin as whispers rippled from one row to another. Faces shifted from disinterest to surprise, and the atmosphere subtly changed. The senior crew member extended his hand slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, and added, "We were notified mid-flight that you recently addressed the United Nations and are traveling as a guest of the Global Human Rights Council. Airport security is waiting to ensure your smooth passage through customs." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the rustle of bags and the clicking of overhead compartments. In the galley, the flight attendant who had mocked the woman earlier now stood frozen, eyes wide, posture stiff. Her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. She looked on helplessly as the truth unraveled before her. The woman she had ridiculed for her accent, whom she had dismissed as unimportant, was not only educated, but internationally revered. The passengers, once indifferent, now looked at the black woman with newfound awareness. Some nodded quietly in respect. Others murmured her name under their breath, as if recognizing it for the first time. The older gentleman beside her gave her a look of quiet pride. The flight attendant took a slow step forward, guilt washing over her face like a tide. She was no longer laughing, no longer smug. Instead, her expression was pale, ashamed, as she realized she had turned cruelty toward someone whose voice spoke in halls she would never enter, whose presence commanded dignity she had failed to offer. As the seatbelt signs blinked off and the cabin filled with the usual sound of passengers preparing to disembark, the black woman rose from her seat with quiet composure. She adjusted her bag, lifted her head, and stepped into the aisle with the same grace she had shown throughout the flight. At that moment, the flight attendant, the one who had mocked her at the gate and again in the air, hurried toward her. Her steps were uncertain, her smile now nervous and strained. She stood in front of the woman, her hands folded, her voice suddenly sweet and overly courteous. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if anything I said earlier came off the wrong way. I didn't mean—" The woman met her gaze with calm, steady eyes. There was no anger, no raised voice, just truth. She paused for a moment, letting the silence speak before her words did. Then, with quiet strength, she said, "It's not my accent that needed fixing. It was your attitude." The attendant froze, her face flushing as the meaning sank in. There was no room for argument, no space for excuses. The simple sentence cut through every pretense and left the truth bare between them. The woman turned without waiting for a reply, her back straight, her steps deliberate. At the front of the cabin, 2 uniformed airport staff waited respectfully to escort her. She offered a polite nod to the senior crew member and then exited the plane with dignity, her presence commanding without needing a single extra word. Behind her, the cabin fell silent. Passengers who had overheard the exchange now watched with admiration. A few clapped softly, not out of spectacle, but in respect, for her strength, her patience, and the quiet way she had turned humiliation into grace. The older man who had sat beside her smiled to himself and shook his head slowly, as if silently saying, "That's how it's done." The flight attendant stood frozen in the aisle, surrounded by a silence that felt heavier than noise. She wasn't humiliated by the woman's fame or her title. That wasn't the part that burned. What stung deepest was realizing how carelessly she had treated someone, how quickly she had judged a stranger as lesser based on nothing more than voice and appearance. The lesson wasn't in the woman's status, it was in her strength. And as the doors closed behind her, a quiet voice echoed in memory. Respect isn't earned by status. It's revealed by how you treat those you think have none.